There has been somewhat of a Twilight renaissance, which has brought back a lot of memories for me, mainly being 12 years old and arguing with my older brother about whether Twilight is the best thing in the whole world or garbage. As a 12-year-old girl, I think you can imagine that I was very much pro-Twilight, and even though my interest in it faded and I was never a hardcore fan, now that it's kind of starting to be a thing again, I don't know why I was doing a TikTok dance there. Essentially, it made me wonder whether Twilight was really as good or as bad as I remember. And above all, why was it so popular? Out of all things, why was it this series that got so popular? So I fell down a bit of a spiral. I read quite a few academic papers about Twilight, and then I kind of branched out and read a bunch of stuff about romance as a genre and how that works. Anything I use I will put in my description so you can go look at my references, because I'm hoping if I seem really smart, the watch time on this video will increase. I've taken everything I've read and I now have an answer. I know why Twilight. I have a theory as to why it was Twilight, so let me take ideas from other people and explain them badly. If you want an answer in just one sentence, then I would tell you that Twilight became popular because it drew on all of the critical literary conventions of romances that have worked throughout history, essentially in romance stories targeted at adults, but it adapted them ever so slightly to fit a contemporary young adult audience. The first thing we're going to be discussing is Bella as the ideal heroine. One of the most common criticisms I've heard about the series, and what my brother and I used to argue about a lot, is that Bella is not a feminist character. She's too passive, she has no agency of her own, and her life essentially just revolves around her boyfriend. She poses a stark contrast to other popular female characters that we've come to know and love in pop culture. A recent example would be Katniss or Triss, or even going back a little bit later would be Buffy. Just the typical strong female character. So what's thrown around a lot is this notion that Bella is so bland so that all girls can identify with her, and essentially it's like self-insert fanfiction. There is, I would say, some truth to that, but the appeal of Bella goes beyond that. And Christine Jarvis has written that the answer may lie partially in understanding how girls are still expected to conform to rigid stereotypes of femininity, though they are now also expected to succeed at school and in careers. Obviously, it's impossible to overgeneralize, but for women like Bella, American middle-class white, they have been given so many more opportunities over the last couple of decades. The idea that girls should and do strive for independence and can be successful is a lot more normalized than it has been in the past, and in real life, girls seemingly flourish at school, they often do better than boys, and young women often access higher education as much as or even more than young men. However, the catch is that even though this progress has been made, the years and years and years of the more traditional patriarchal values that have been instilled in women for so long persist. You can't just undo those. What that means is that a lot of the time girls grow up with contradictory desires. They want to be strong, they want to be independent and pursue the opportunities that some of us have been lucky enough to have been given, but at the same time, we still want to be pretty, we still want to chase the ideal of being skinny, we still feel that male attention equals to validation. We're expected to be sensitive and to prioritize our families above ourselves. You could argue that the reason Bella was so widely successful at this time is because Bella gets to have the best of both worlds. The book loves to remind us that she doesn't care about clothes, and she shows up to Forks with a scanty wardrobe, and she's happy that her plain black jacket didn't stand out, and when they go dress shopping, Bella can only really pretend to care about the dresses, but really she's thinking about a bookstore. Bella is not like other girls. But at the same time, Bella still manages to become the pinnacle of traditional patriarchal femininity. The best way to explain what I mean here is through the wedding. Christine Jarvis again writes, a heroine whose main objective was marriage and a splendid wedding would have limited appeal, but a heroine who rejects these but gets them anyway enables the girl reader to satisfy her contradictory desires. Bella initially has an aversion to the thought of marriage, and she even says, I had been raised to cringe at the thought of poofy white dresses and bouquets. She conforms to the ideal of rejecting femininity, but Edward won't turn her into a vampire unless they're married, and if she doesn't become a vampire, the Volturi would kill her, and they would also pose a threat to the Cullens. She's not a gold digger going for Edward and wanting to lock him down for selfish reasons. No, she ends up just having a wonderful wedding as kind of a side product. Therefore, Bella's decision to marry isn't your typical girl just wanting an ostentatious wedding, but instead is presented as someone who's sort of sacrificing themselves. And she does try to resist this fairy tale-esque wedding, but Alice tells her that the Cullens would be hurt if they had a quiet wedding with no guests, and essentially she's talked into having this elaborate wedding that she didn't even really want. And Bella is so uninvolved that she doesn't even choose her own dress. And the fourth book definitely lingers on the detail of the wedding. It's meant to be something that's presumably enjoyed by the reader, and the reason the reader can feel gratified to the extent that they probably are is because they don't feel discomfort that Bella is too weak or too traditional because she didn't want the marriage, and yet she still gets to enjoy all of the wedding's benefits. And alongside this, it's also interesting to note that this is another way in which Bella really falls into the category of a typical romance character, because in a lot of traditional romances, the heroine is presented as inherently good. So she's never seeking to elevate her status, but a byproduct of her true love is always a social elevation of some kind. So as soon as Bella marries into the Cullen family, she has wealth and she has status. Alongside this, another really important trope is the makeover, which I think we all know from movies. Bella at her wedding gets a more explicit makeover since Alice takes her into the bathroom, which has all the paraphernalia of a beauty salon, and tells her, "No one is going to call you plain when I'm through with you." She gives her a new face, and Bella ends up wearing a fabric masterpiece, a designer dress. But again, so that the reader doesn't feel discomfort, Bella doesn't even really look at herself in the mirror. She says, "All I really saw was Edward's face," until Edward tells her how utterly heartbreakingly beautiful she was, and then she can look at herself in the mirror and she sees a dark-haired beauty. But this bridal makeover really pales in comparison to the makeover that occurs throughout the entire series. It already starts in the first book because Bella initially is very awkward. She's kind of presented to have this two left feet kind of personality, and she describes having been somewhat of a social outcast at her last school, but immediately is this object of fascination in Forks, and why she's able to maintain that level of fascination is never really explained, but that's kind of where the makeover already starts, and then it is taken to a more extreme level when she starts dating Edward, and Jessica tells her on the first day that apparently none of the girls here are good looking enough for him. So once Bella is associated with Edward, that already elevates her social status a little bit. She holds this highly coveted position that no one else was able to take on. And as soon as she starts to date Edward, even though Bella is still very clumsy and seems to have absolutely no control over her own body or her own life to a certain extent, she does end up having the power to influence an extremely powerful mythical creature. So this is what we, again, tend to see in a lot of romance novels. Even though the heroine is physically weak, the author essentially gives her power through the association to the hero. And then this relationship with Edward obviously leads to her becoming a vampire, which is then the ultimate makeover. After she's transformed, her face is flawless, her skin is luminous as a pearl, she's a carving of a goddess, and she describes her own dizzying beauty. And she will be this extremely beautiful creature forever. I would argue the reader is meant to take pleasure in this transformation that has taken place, not just socially, but now also physically. Clearly there's a high level of wish fulfillment taking place for a lot of the readers, because Bella will be able to live this idealized life forever, and she's able to do that without compromising her feminist upbringing, and she's also able to become a mother, which arguably in a more traditional definition of what femininity is, motherhood is incredibly important. And for Bella, motherhood is honestly laughably easy. Everyone loves Renesmee. Bella receives unlimited support from her extended family. Bella never needs to sleep, and neither does anyone else. And in addition to that, Renesmee drinks donated blood, so she doesn't even have to go through what it would be like to breastfeed, or just anything that would be what it's really like to have a baby. One of the papers I read said that being the mother of Renesmee seems rather like playing with a doll. Bella has perfect grades, and she seems very hardworking, and she's accepted into the colleges she wants to go to, I believe. Ultimately, that isn't what gives her success. And this is essentially what it is like for a lot of girls. Christine Jarvis again wrote, "The status of young women is not constructed as it is popular conveyed through academic and career success, but by conformity to unspoken patriarchal norms." This is exactly what happens in Bella's life, but in a very idealized fashion. One of the things I read for this video, and just because it was fun, was a book by Janice Radway, which is called Reading Romance, and it's so interesting because what she does is she takes a sample of women in the 80s in the US who were all romance readers. So they would read an incredible amount of romance books like this, which I didn't know that those books weren't just smut, but they are not. And what she did was she contacted Dorothy Evans, who had a nationally known romance recommendation newsletter. And she was essentially one of the only people at the time who really know what makes a good romance versus a bad romance, since publishers were just turning out one book after another, just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And Dorothy Evans was able to kind of go through all of them and offer the best selection. Radway used that to kind of outline romances in general at the time, what makes them successful, and why romance was being read so compulsively by these women. One of the things that Radway theorized was that readers used the romance to address their unmet needs experienced precisely because that ideal relationship is made highly improbable by the institutional structure and engendering practices of contemporary society. So Radway's idea, combined with what Jarvis has pointed out, would suggest that the reason Bella or Twilight became so popular was because young women found something in it that they were missing in their own lives. It was the ability to live out both of the contradictory desires they held in a more complex way than just, oh, girls want to be Bella because your boyfriend is really hot. There's more to it than simple escapism. But speaking of Bella's hot boyfriend, he certainly helped. So let's talk about why Edward is the ideal hero of a romance novel. Edward is perfect in all the obvious ways. He's conventionally attractive, he's going to be young forever, he doesn't breathe heavily or smell bad or anything like that. But another thing that makes him so appealing is that he is simultaneously 17 and 109. And Lydia Kokkola writes that Bella's incessant harping on about Edward's perfection, along with the reader's observations about how noble, self-sacrificing, and understanding Edward can be, underlines his traditionally adult virtues, while his initial jealousy over Bella's relationship with Jacob, his sudden bursts of rage, and his initial difficulties in keeping his desire for Bella in check reveal a more traditional adolescent character. He represents the perfect balance between adult and adolescent. And I think the fact that Edward does have this maturity is integral to Twilight. So let's come back to Janice Radway and her romance readers. Dorothy Evans, the writer of the newsletter, in an interview with Radway stated that, "I've always thought that women are more insightful into men's psyches than men are into women's. Well, men just don't take the time. They just don't." Radway concluded that what women are looking for in their search for the perfect romantic fantasy is a man who is capable of the same attentive observation and intuitive understanding that they believe women regularly accord to men. And that is exactly what Edward does. At the start of the series, Bella is moving in with a father she doesn't really know all that well, and it's implied that her entire life she has simply been taking care of her mother, and that nobody has ever really shown her unconditional love. And that's partly why you could say she puts herself into all these stupid, dangerous situations, and why she tries to sacrifice herself for Edward, and she makes that really stupid plan in the first book. She just simply can't seem to grasp that anyone would love her enough to care more about her well-being than their own. And through Edward, she finally realizes that someone can actually love her, and he also just makes her more mature by teaching her how to keep her desires in check. You know, she's constantly ready to die for the D, and Edward is like, no you won't. And at this point, I just want to add that Radway conducted a pretty small survey with about 30-40 participants about what they valued most in the male characters they read about in romances. And the most important factor was intelligence, then it was tenderness, which is the thing I just talked about, I would say, a sense of humor, and the least important out of 10 traits or so was a good body. And obviously, maybe the women were kind of picking the things that made them seem less vain, but it was an anonymous survey, and I do think that is a pretty good representation of what women are looking for in romance. It is more about an emotional fulfillment. And Twilight is a pretty stark contrast to, I would say, what we see more often, which is a manic pixie dream girl or something of that sort that teaches the main male character how to love. So why is it so important to recognize, read, and accept Twilight as a very typical romance? And I would say it is, in order to understand why it's so successful, because like I said, the dynamic between Bella and Edward is very common in a lot of romances. Yes, Bella might seem passive, but in a romance story that isn't seen as a negative thing, because female characters, or all the characters really, are defined by their attachment to who they love rather than who they are for themselves. But Twilight isn't really marketed as romance, and true romance isn't something we see as much in the young adult publishing world, I would say. Usually you have a supernatural romance, paranormal romance, a dystopian romance, all kinds of romances. So for example, the readers that Radway studied had very rigid expectations for a romance novel and for the things that happen within it that a lot of Twilight readers simply didn't or still don't have. And Rachel Hendershot Parkin wrote about that while Twilighters, she insists on calling Twilight fans Twilighters in her essay, but I'm just gonna say Twilight fans from now on, please forgive me, I just can't say that word. While Twilight fans may not recognize the series as part of the traditional romance genre and criticize it for its romantic elements, they often devour it for those same reasons. Twilight fans swoon over Edward. Many fans do not feel that Bella's space is violated when he spends every night for months sneaking into her bedroom and watching her sleep. Rather than interpret Edward as a stalker, fans gush about his devotion to Bella. Female readers do seem to delight in the care Edward takes of Bella and willingly accept his assertive character, a common feature in romance novels. At the same time, however, many of those readers resist the passive elements of Bella's nature. And the idea of readers resisting elements of Twilight, even though they love it as a series, is something we'll get to when we talk about why it's such a cult text. But for now, I think it's really important to discuss another convention of typical romances, or at least the romances that Radway studied, and draw a parallel to Twilight. Another reason why people love making fun of Twilight is obviously because the writing is bad. Radway writes that the contemporary romance's prose is dominated by cliché, simple vocabulary, and standard syntax. Quick read or comprehension is therefore made possible by the resolute familiarity of the romance language. Readers never discover meanings in or behind the words they find on the page. In fact, the above-mentioned linguistic techniques all maintain the illusion that language is a transparent window, opening out onto an already existent world. For example, Dorothy Evans and her readers, when asked about their favorite books, were far more likely to simply detail the plot and never really even address the writing style itself at all. Even repetitive phrases or plot points were really successful in those sorts of romances because the reader will recognize the phrase or the event and immediately know which emotions or reactions to associate with that particular thing, and it's simply less exhausting and the energy can go towards the element of escapism more so than the act of interpretation. This again gives us an insight into how romance readers generally read the texts that they love. And for Twilight, it's really not meant to be read as literary fiction. It's not the kind of text you would want to sit down and admire the beautiful language. And that's, I would say, okay, because that is not the point. It is about the love story between Bella and Edward, and to get you as close to that story as possible. And simplistic language does a far better job at conveying the story to a mass audience than a more complex style ever could. So this again contributes to its incredible success. So when we understand how the book is actually being read, we see why things like Bella being bland actually kind of work. If we are simply told by Meyer that Bella works really hard and she's good at school, then okay, we go Bella's smart and we accept that. We don't really want to second guess it. And something that Radway also found is that readers generally don't look for super realistic characters. They understand that the people they encounter in these stories are idealized and never someone that they would meet in their day-to-day lives. But they're willing to suspend their disbelief as long as the motivations of the characters are believable. So even though Bella is kind of meh, she's fueled by anxiety and by an infatuation with a cute boy, and those motivations are believable even if she as a character isn't. These are all things that are more generally about why romance is so widely successful, but I also found some stuff about why Twilight specifically essentially garnered a cult following. Matt Hill suggests that cult texts are not entirely arbitrary and they share family resemblances. The first of those being an endlessly deferred narrative, which Twilight definitely is, because I mean everyone is just waiting for 4 books for them to fall. The second one is a word I can't actually pronounce.
Hyperdiegesis.
Yes. This is a term coined by Matt Hills, and it essentially equates a story, a novel, a film, anything like that to an iceberg, where the narrative presented represents the 10% visible above water, but is so well constructed that the audience can imagine the 90% that is still hidden. And that very much applies to Twilight. I think we can all agree that the story of Carlisle living with vampire kings for a couple hundred years and learning how to resist human blood and become a doctor, or the story of how Alice was in an asylum before she was turned and she doesn't even remember any of it, or all the different vampires from across the world that we meet, all of them are more interesting than Bella and Edward. So I think that just provides so much room for fan speculation and fan fiction, and for them to really feel like the world that Meyer has created is real. And the third, and I think most important feature of a cult text in the sense of Twilight is auteurism.
Auteurism.
This is when the creator of a story becomes a representation of that story in some way. Mostly because they want to maintain some kind of subjective control over the work even though it's already published. Kinda J.K. Rowling tweeting about how everyone is gay all of a sudden. And Stephenie Meyer just couldn't let go of her story for a very long time. She's openly resisted any kind of anti-feminist interpretation of Twilight, and she's insisted in probably more than one interview that Bella can be a strong person by just being who she is and being strong mentally. But a lot of the disputes between Meyer and her fans mostly stem from the actual vampire world that Meyer has created. The most controversial point probably being the pregnancy. A couple of months before New Moon was released, Meyer was giving this interview, and in it she said, "I've had tons of people ask if vampires can have babies. The answer is no." She also claimed that most human fluids are absent in my vampires. No sweat, no tears, no blood besides that which they ingest. They don't have their own blood. So that basically means no vampire boners, so no vampire babies? Whatever. Basically, no one ever thought Bella would get pregnant, and they were genuinely shocked and also upset because it seemed to make absolutely no sense. Meyer tried to defend herself by saying that most fluids were absent, but throughout the vampire's body are many versions of venom-based fluids that retain a marked resemblance to the fluid that was replaced and function in much the same way and toward the same purpose. Basically, Edward could not. Like, that's all she's trying to tell us. But there were lots of angry fans all over the internet, one of whom wrote that Meyer bitch slapped logic in the face and blew basic biology out of the window. So many fans at the time were arguing against this stupid vampire baby because it just didn't work in Meyer's own universe. Apparently she established that werewolves have 24 chromosomes and vampires have 25 and humans have 23. So you couldn't have a species with 25 chromosomes breed with one that is 23.
I don't really want to talk more about the logistics of vampire babies, but I googled the thing with the chromosomes, and that's not even true. I don't fucking know. But if you were in the Twilight forums back in the day and you know what the argument here was, then please let me know.
One blogger wrote about how on Angel, the TV show, they also had an unexpected vampire baby. But that reader was far more willing to accept that vampire baby in Angel than the one in Twilight. And the blogger claims that she's more willing to believe Angel's baby than Bella's is because the child is passed off as an anomaly. There's no attempt to explain it. So because all of the explaining Meyer tried to do, Bella's baby couldn't just be passed off as an anomaly because it was so clearly a canonical breach. So this created a sense of betrayal. And over the past couple of years, fandoms have grown into much more of a participatory culture than a simple passive one. So readers were angry, and they really wanted everyone to know they were angry. So this anger and the sheer amount of readers there were, plus what Parkin calls their shared anticipation of how the canon operates and their high-level investment, give them a competitive edge in vying with Meyer for creation of the horizon of expectation and textual ownership. So readers kept trying to tell Stephenie Meyer that the way she was writing her books was wrong. For example, people also weren't happy with Breaking Dawn because choice seemed to be integral to the first 3 books. For example, Meyer sets up the choice between Edward and Jacob and the pain that will ensue because she will inevitably have to give one of them up. But in Breaking Dawn, she can conveniently have both of them without any pain and everyone is happy. She can also turn into a vampire and just completely skip the bloodlust. Bella also doesn't lose Charlie. All of the problems surrounding choice and the cost of those choices that were set up in the first 3 books were very much diminished in the 4th book, and the fallout really wasn't painful in any way. A lot of readers felt like the happy end kind of cheapened the stakes of the entire series. In addition to that, J. Martin believes that intense, obsessive, passionate love, a love of the Wuthering Heights variety to which Meyer compares her own story, demands an exacting price. And that is exactly what we never got. So readers essentially, because of all of these reasons, felt the need to criticize Twilight and to kind of make it their own by protesting a lot of the elements in the story. And whereas some authors might let that go, Stephenie Meyer really fought back. For example, she had a whole graphic novel dedicated to Riley, she wrote Midnight Sun, and she even released an official illustrated guide. And one of the papers stated that while these projects promised to build on the world established in the 4 Twilight books, the purpose of each of these projects seems not to stem from a desire to continue the story, but rather to control the horizon of expectation, to define the canon and retain ownership over her characters. Marketing the guide with superlatives like official and definitive lends credibility to the information it contains, and attempts to endow Meyer with authority and ownership. And Midnight Sun is actually a really interesting example of this as well, because she initially intended to post it online because she felt Edward deserved to have his story told, and she couldn't wait out the years it will take to reach publication for people to begin to understand Edward. She kind of immediately wanted to go against whatever interpretation fans may or may not have had. Writing from Edward's perspective is also very important here because Edward can hear everyone's thoughts, so when you're writing about Edward, you can also write about everyone else and thus maintain your control. It is not very surprising then that she felt so angry when Midnight Sun was leaked in the middle of her still writing it, because again, it really showed that fans felt like they were entitled to have the book, and to some extent felt like it was their own. So Twilight's not just popular because of all the conventional reasons romance is popular, but also because it was published at a time where the internet allowed it to turn into this incredible tug of war between the author and the fandom. Those are definitely not all the reasons Twilight was as popular as it was or is, but those are a lot of reasons that I haven't really heard anyone else discuss, so I hope you found this interesting.